Hello and welcome. My name is Melissa Neff, and I would like to take a few minutes today to talk to you about applying transformative learning to our classroom experiences with our offenders. So this is what I like to call taking it to the street, because obviously whatever skills we're teaching our students in correctional setting, we want to make sure that they're transferable for them to take with them to the outside and make them applicable to what's going to help them from day to day. So I'm going to go ahead and just start sharing my screen so we can move through the topic, because gosh, 20 minutes will go by so quickly. Again, my name is Melissa Neff. I work with the Colorado Department of Corrections. I am currently a teacher. I teach high school equivalency or GED AAA class, which is a college preparatory class that we call academic achievement and success. And I also teach a lot of the cognitive education programs. In addition to that, I'm an adjunct professor at our local community college. So I've worked with adults in their learning styles for quite a while now. Today, I want to make sure that we leave with an understanding of what transformative learning is, and then understand what a disorienting dilemma is and what role that plays in adult learning, in particular with our criminal justice involved students. And then show you kind of how I've applied that knowledge to creating a capstone program for some of my students, and how you can use this knowledge to build that into your program as well. So let's talk a little bit first just about adult learning. So much of learning theory is really focused on kids because that's when kids are ready to learn, just because they're kids. Their brains are hardwired to accept information. And when you go to look up some different theories for adults, they're not always easy to find. Most of adult learning theory is focused, on those kids. And so when I started looking, I'm specifically looking what works for adults. And I found some theories on transformative learning that were created initially by Jack Mesereau. And his theories originally were put together in the mid to late 70s. And there's been some expansion of those theories over time. But I'm going to focus on two core areas that he asserted even back then were critical for adults to have this transformative learning experience. So what does that mean exactly? What is a transformative learning experience, or what is transformative learning? We all know that we can give information to people, but if we don't have them somehow contextualize it, make it practical, make it useful to them, and do something with that information, it can be meaningless. And so what I found interesting about this idea of transformative learning is all of our learning is rooted in our individual experiences. That is why we often don't understand why just the threat of maybe going to prison or being incarcerated isn't enough to keep people from making those decisions that bring them back into our system. Because our experiences frame how we have learned that information, as well as the experience of the offenders and the folks that we're teaching frames how they process information. So that becomes our meaning structure. Our meaning structure is based on our concepts, beliefs, judgments, and our feelings about different things, as well as how our thinking has worked out for us in the past, if that makes sense. How the way we think has gotten us either into or out of good or bad situations in the past. So this idea of transformative learning is really defined as an orientation that holds that the way that learners interpret and reinterpret their sensory experience is central to making meaning, and therefore central to their learning. And I think this makes sense if we really think about it. And often for those that are involved in the criminal justice system, their meaning structure is very different than other students that you might teach. And so though their meaning structure very often leans toward antisocial ways of thinking, which are hard for those of us who are more pro-social to relate to. So we want to have the ability then to take what we're giving them and make it a transformative situation so that they are changing again how they think about things. So if we look at educational theory, it ties kind of closely to some criminological theory. When I first read Mesereau's theory, I thought, this is kind of like differential association, but just we're trying to get people to pick up pro-social ways of thinking as opposed to antisocial ways. And for those that aren't as familiar, differential association is a criminological theory developed by Sutherland that basically says that those who are committing antisocial behaviors, such as criminals, will learn to be better criminals by associating with criminals. And so oftentimes when we incarcerate people, put them in jail or prison, they learn to be better criminals because that's who they're associating with. And so I assert that if we believe that that's the case, that those negative behaviors can be learned, we also have to believe that Mesereau's theory that says that positive behaviors can be learned from associating with people who are thinking more positively and are learning to transform from that antisocial way to a more pro-social way of thinking. And Mesereau really just said, personal change begins with social change. We change personally because those around us are allowing us to see the benefit of changing. So then we say, how do we do this in the classroom? What can we do to kind of support this way of thinking and these beliefs for our students? So when talking to employers and some higher education professionals, I mentioned I'm also an adjunct professor at the community college, and in talking to some of the other professors there, and even in our secondary schools in our school district, so many of those professionals are telling me that there's key skills that they're just not seeing in students. And that's the idea of metacognition, being able to think about your thinking. What does it mean to be a thinker? How does our thinking change the way we behave and the way that we reference things around us? Critical thinking and problem solving are another skill that we just see lacking quite a bit. And then those social skills and recognizing the social skills that are appropriate and necessary in the workplace, as well as those that are appropriate and necessary in the educational place, and maybe those that are appropriate and necessary in your social group, having not only recognition, but being able to put those into practice. So those are three areas that I found to be important. And I also found they really dovetail well with Mesereau's theory. And two of his key components that he emphasizes that said that must come into play in order for transformational learning to take place are this idea of a disorienting dilemma and then a culminating experience. And we can take these skills and build them into our disorienting, dilemma and culminating experience. So your next question is probably going to be, what is a disorienting dilemma? Really, it's an educational situation that challenges the learner to reframe their beliefs about a topic. And I want to caution you from thinking that this educational situation has to take place in a classroom. Any situation we get into, any moment can be a teaching moment. And so recognize that this situation where we're learning, where we're providing education could happen anywhere. So these disorienting dilemmas are commonly seen as an integral part of transformative learning. A disorienting dilemma represents the initiation of the transformative learning experience. Usually, very often, is a life crisis that triggers a questioning of your assumptions and results in transformed beliefs. So some examples of that might be loss of a job, divorce, death of a loved one, bankruptcy. And I like this one, returning to a civilian life. So returning to civilian life might apply to people that are in the military or even paramilitary organizations like police and corrections. But what about this idea of returning to civilian life from prison? It can be a very overwhelming, very stressful time for our offenders. So if you're not able to kind of cope with those things, then you're going to feel like you're plunged into this area of chaos. And so that's what creates this disorienting dilemma. So can we create a disorienting dilemma or acknowledge a disorienting dilemma in the classroom in order to address it? Absolutely. And so I think our criminal justice system and the offenders that we work with in our classes are a prime example of this disorienting dilemma and how we can put it into play to help strengthen transformative learning. The other piece that Mesereau really talks about is this idea of a culminating experience. And you may have heard this referred to as a capstone or a graduation portfolio or something like that. I think the way that we can use this here in our setting is giving our students an opportunity to evaluate, synthesize, and analyze the information that we're giving them. But most importantly is having them personalize it, having them take all this information and now put it together and say, how does this apply to me? So I use the Career Preparedness Certification curriculum in iCEV for one of the classes I teach, the AAA class, which is again that college preparedness class, which also really brings up a lot of workplace preparedness skills as well. And I put together a capstone that dovetails and builds on some of the skills and lessons plans in that preparedness certification curriculum. So some of the areas that I chose to use were the career testing and investigation lesson, the goal setting basics lesson, and then this idea of portfolio development as part of job search, and then workplace issues. So the career testing and investigation lesson really kind of talks about what are the things you want to do, what would you be good at, what interests you. And I've taken that and made it a little bit of a deeper conversation by having students research careers. We look at what education might be required for that career. And I use some different interest profilers in that process. And those are things that you may even be able to find just in public domain by researching them online. Some interest profiler assessments that your students can take. And then we dig deeper, like I said. What's required for education? Is this something I can do with having a criminal background? What would it pay? How can I pay my bills if I decide to do that? Then we look at goal setting basics. And I have a worksheet that I use, and I'll make sure that it gets uploaded for the resources on this course as well, that I just have sitting on my desk during the entire time of the course. And I tell my students, take a new sheet. Anytime you think you have a new goal, take a new sheet, write it down. Now, change your goal, update it as we talk more about goal setting and what that looks like. And we make sure that we're using the SMART model, so things are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-bound, and teaching those students in class what goal setting looks like. What is a short-term goal? What is a long-term goal? What is a realistic goal? And build on that piece. And then those goal setting sheets become something that they turn in as part of their capstone. Portfolio development is also another lesson that's included in the career preparedness certificate. And we are kind of creating an example of that with this capstone. Here's all your information. We look at resumes, any course certificates that you might have completed, and keeping all that information together so that you can use it when it's appropriate for your job search. I think that activity serves a couple of purposes. Number one, it helps prepare us for job search and being ready for interviews. But number two, we work with a clientele that very often doesn't focus on the positive things that they've done. And seeing yourself on paper, so to speak, can be very empowering. Wow, I do have some good work skills. I have done some good things in the past. I have made progress. Be able to see that all in one place. So it builds their confidence moving forward. Then the fourth area that I chose to use out of the Career Preparedness Certificate program is workplace issues. So those workplace issues really looks at avoiding conflict, solving conflict, how to work with people, what are the appropriate skills to use in the workplace. And in using this particular topic, what I've had my students do is do learning style questionnaires, and I will provide those as well. I have my students learn what is their learning style. Then we look at and talk about specific workplace issues they may have had in their history, and look at maybe that issue was caused because I'm trying to share information with someone who doesn't learn the way I do. And we get stuck in doing the same thing over and over and saying things the same way, trying to share information with someone, and they don't receive it that way. So not only do I have my students learn their learning style, I have them recognize that others have different learning styles and what are the ways that you can best address those learning styles in your communication. And that requires some self-reflection, and it also requires them to look at others then and document that information and think of better ways to handle the situation. So that is very eye-opening for a lot of my students. They enjoy that piece, being able to say, oh, I see now how I might be able to improve the outcomes by doing that. So by putting transformative learning into practice, right, we need to look at three things. First of all, what are the practical or contextual skills that you really want your students to learn? What do they need to take from your training? And then build your culminating experience around that. We might talk about a whole lot of different things, but these key factors are what you need to know. Now, this is where I want you to think more critically. Then this piece is really, it may be difficult in your facility. I know in past facilities I've worked in, our management team and all of those folks were always eager to be part of being in a class or listening to people give their presentations. And so when you can, invite outside stakeholders in. If you're in a facility where you have volunteers that can come in and might be willing to listen, that's great. Give your students a chance to present their information and build relationship with folks from the outside and just practice being in front of other people. It also makes their time feel like it's much more valuable, that the time they sunk into this project is important to someone besides just them. I have developed a few other activities too that develop those three areas, the metacognition and problem solving that I talked about earlier. And so I'd like to talk first about this idea of blooms around the room. I went back to just basic Bloom's taxonomy and created a lesson plan that teaches students how to ask better questions. Bloom's gives us the words to do it. And very often our students get stuck on that base level of knowledge, the who, what, when, where. Well, let's talk about why. Let's dig a little deeper into analyzing information. So what I've done is I will find a reading passage that's about any topic we happen to be discussing, and I have the class read it. But prior to that, we talk about blooms, and I will attach the worksheets here also to be shared with you that just lists the words that drive those questions that you can ask within blooms. And then what I do is I put words up around the room that say whether this is a knowledge question or a comprehension question. And I have students create the questions around that topic, and then they exchange them with each other. And then they move around the room and say what area they think it falls into. You could also modify this if you're in a higher custody level facility where you can't move around the room. Send around a poster. This page is knowledge. Put your question on here. Write it on there if you need to, and be able to think a little more deeply about the questions that you're asking. And then I have done a critical thinking activity where we create some scenario-based budgets. I create a scenario, here's a family, here's their needs, here's where they need to live, here's what the potential costs are, and then we come together in consensus. What has to be cut? What are the priorities? It helps them think critically about how is their money going to be spent, and how do we make choices around those things that are kind of difficult. And the third activity that I have created, and some people think this is funny, because very often in our facilities, our offenders are really good at making complaints. But what I saw when I worked with parole is often when they release, they no longer think they have a right to complain about things that really are important. I worked with an offender that was dealing with a landlord that really wasn't keeping their home safe and those kinds of things. They didn't think they could complain because they would get in trouble. And so I created a lesson plan around writing a letter of complaint and having them learn to express that complaint appropriately. And then we also role play in class. How are you going to say these things? What is the best way to do this without getting angry? And role playing those skills is very important. And again, I will share that information as well for you to take a look at in resources for this workshop. This is where I found some of my information about Mesereau's adult learning theory. So I just wanted to share that if you'd like to take a look at that journal article. Again, my name is Melissa Neff, and I welcome comments or questions if you want to delve a little bit deeper into this idea of transformative learning and how you might be able to take the topics that you're teaching and make them a little more transformative. I would love to be able to chat with any of you. I've included a couple email addresses here. Either one is great. And again, I thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best and stay safe. Have a great day.